So I want to go over this question again that I answered in this week's Training Lab Q&A, just because I like this question so much and I think every single person in this group has so much to learn from really deeply understanding the answer to this. And all of us have actually answered this question for ourselves before when we've sat down and tried to work out what we actually want to put into a workout and what we're going to train that day or that week or that month. And without actually understanding how you're coming up with the answers to these questions, or that you're even answering these questions at all in the process, you're pretty much guaranteeing that you're going to end up wasting time and energy on parts of your training that you'll just never get the return on investment that you're hoping for. So the question is about organizing goals, and this is how you try and actually put together a training program that serves multiple goals at the same time. In Ryan's case here, he's talking about, you want more size, you also want to achieve new calisthenic skills, you also want to drop some fat at the same time, and you've got injuries to consider as well. And I wanted to just clarify my answer to this because I think there's room for this clarity to really get through to a few people and change how you look at training pretty much forever. And all of the programs that I write for myself and that you have access to in the classroom address these answers incredibly specifically with their design, and I'll explain how that is so you know exactly what you're looking at when you go through these training programs. So what we've got here are some of our most commonly sought goals with our training. We want to get stronger, we want to grow, we want to get more muscle, and we want to develop more skills. And all of these interact with each other. None of these are entirely independent. Strength comes from an accumulation of coordination gains and skill in the right places, combined with hypertrophy and growth. The kind of things that get us strength and get us skill are also going to get us some growth, but only to a point. And skills we will develop in the process of chasing some of these two, but if we don't actually worry about that independently, we're going to hit a bottleneck very, very quickly in the intermediate stage of training. So what this line is down the bottom here is where we actually place all of these different goals that we've got. And what this line is, this is what we call our maximum recoverable volume. And all this is, all that fancy acronym means, is the total amount of work that we can do and still see good results, still see any results really, without pushing ourselves off the end of this and into the overtraining territory where not only does progress slow down, it can actually go backwards, and then we're risking things like injury, of course, as well. So chasing all of these goals at once is actually super easy if we're willing to chase them all super slowly, because this is a certain dose of strength, this is a certain dose of hypertrophy, and here's a certain dose of skills. And if we're willing to keep the dose pretty low, we're going to leave a lot of room in our maximum recoverable volume. We're not going to burn out, and there's going to be very, very little risk of any of this stuff happening over here. The downside of that is, of course, this is slow progress, and that's not really what we want. We want to try and work out how we can put these together in a way that gets us close to the end over here without pushing ourselves over the top of it. And so someone might think, I want to get a handstand push-up and push skills, or I just want to grow as much muscle as possible right now. So I'm going to put this and make that pretty much all of my maximum recoverable volume, as big as possible, and get as much as possible out of this one goal. And the problem there becomes, apart from the fact that just going all in on one type of adaptation, we call it, or one type of improvement, means you will have to work harder to get those results, because the results are usually diminishing the more of the same improvement that you target within any given time. The other thing is that these other things that you might not care about as much, but you probably care about at least a bit. These require a certain amount of volume just to not lose them. And this minimum amount of volume that you need to just make sure that you're not losing gains that you've already made on strength or certain skills, or the other way around, on muscles that you've already grown, this is called maintenance volume. And as it sounds, this is just the bare minimum that you have to do to just keep the gains that you've already made in these sitting there and not going backwards. So the trick to chasing all of these at once is that we want to make sure that not only are we not overstepping the maximum recoverable volume, but we're never sitting underneath the minimum volume needed to actually maintain these. And of course, if we want to actually get better at them, we're going to have to push beyond that minimum. So now that should beg the question, what is the minimum needed to maintain each of these? For strength, if you're doing the exact movement that you're trying to maintain strength on, you can literally get away with a couple of sets a week, one set on one day, one set on another day, just of that target movement, sitting in that 5-ish rep range where you're working heavy enough to still be working on those specific strength adaptations, and that will do a pretty good job at actually keeping your strength maintained. The cool part is too, that is actually quite similar to what will maintain hypertrophy. So if the muscle growth that you care about happens to also fall well within strength, for example, a weighted dip, if you're worrying about chest and tricep development, maintaining strength on that dip is also going to do a pretty good job at maintaining chest and tricep volume. So that makes maintaining these guys pretty easy. Skills, on the other hand, are even easier. If you've ever heard the phrase, it's like riding a bicycle, that's because your brain stores motor patterns and stores skills that it's developed for a very long time. And they will degrade a bit over time. And if your body changes in that time, or your balance of strength between muscles changes in that time, your brain and your nervous system will have to do some recalibrating when you go back to those skills. But once you actually have a skill, the amount needed to maintain it is very, very small. For something like a handstand push-up or a muscle up, you could pretty comfortably maintain the level that you're at with literally a couple of sets of super high quality, fresh reps, 2 or 3 done once a week. And that'll pretty much guarantee that you won't lose performance on these from the skill component anyway. So that all sounds like not much, and it isn't much. And that's a key takeaway in and of itself, because understanding what maintenance volume is a hack in and of itself for mitigating times where you're not motivated enough to train much. If you know how little that you actually need to put in to make sure that you just don't lose progress on those weeks where you can't make it into training much, or you just don't have the time, or you just don't have the energy, it's so easy to just make sure that you don't go backwards on those weeks. When you want to make progress though, this gets trickier. Skills actually require a pretty high volume to consistently get good at, because your brain needs a pretty solid amount of regular exposure to better movement patterns than it's already got to convince it that the way it's already doing something needs to actually improve. So if learning something like a handstand push-up or a muscle up or a planche or a front lever is pretty high priority for you, the time and effort and volume that you put into skills needs to be pretty high. I'm talking at least 2, if not 3 times a week, or sometimes even 4 times a week in terms of frequency, always very, very early in your session, always staying far away from failure, so that quality and perfect execution is always your absolute top priority, and you're getting enough of a dose of it regularly enough that your brain has to recognize that what you're showing it is the better way to do it. What this usually means is that you'll end up pushing yourself pretty hard on these skills, and you'll have to be quite conservative about what you do with your other improvement goals. For example, if I have a program where my pull focuses are very skill-based and I've got muscle ups, some front lever holds, and one arm pull-ups in there, skills is going to be a very, very, very big part of my maximum recoverable volume weekly for pull. And growth and hypertrophy are going to strictly stay on maintenance usually, because I know that there's just not going to be room in this line for me to fit in improvements across the board on all of those things. And conversely, when I shift back to a strength or a hypertrophy phase, these skills go on maintenance, which, like we discussed, can be a very small volume really. And you'll see this in my programs where I'll usually allocate a little bit of optional volume in there just for maintenance of things like skills, where you might have an exercise where you can either choose a couple of sets of a more accessory-based push exercise, or it might be a couple of just quality low intensity planche holds, not to get better at planches, but just to make sure you don't lose any of those gains you might have already made in programs up till then. Then that leaves you plenty of room in this line to capitalize on maxing out these other 2, so that then you can hit the end of that 8 or 12 week program and then swap back and then rearrange these things however you want. And the other goals Ryan mentioned were managing fat loss and injuries at the same time. And there's a reason that these don't sit on this same line. These aren't actually things that take up space on this line. What these do instead is they actually shorten the line itself. And now if you're in a cut phase and you're lacking calories, you're lacking nutrients to recover, maybe your sleep quality's dropped a little bit because of hunger signals, or of course if you're nursing an injury, then your capacity to push your training goes right down, and all of these things have to become smaller if you want to fit them into your maximum recoverable volume. And this is why I've actually built into my app recommendations that will pop up during your training periods, recommending what you do with your diet based on what I know to be the intensity of each phase of your training program. So that if you're going to be lacking energy or lacking capacity to recover, we're going to place that in block 1 when you're adapting to a new program, and we know the volume and intensities are going to be a bit lower, your performance isn't going to be as high. So all of these 3 things end up being a little bit smaller anyway, and we don't run the risk of tipping you over the edge of this. This is also why I recommend getting into those mobility and stability tools that I put in the classroom and at least evaluating the points that you know are your weak spots before the start of each program so that you can troubleshoot and identify exactly what you need to do to make sure that this injuries component doesn't come in and end up drastically shortening this line and making the potential results you can get always limited no matter what you might do. As soon as you can start to wrap your head around this a little bit, your progress just gets so much more effective and so much more consistent because not only are you making sure that you're doing the right amount to get better, you're making sure that you're never accidentally slipping into doing the wrong amount and going backwards or pushing yourself too hard and ending up having to dial back your training because you overtrained, came in too fatigued, your performance dropped, or you got injured. And across at least a few years of training, this kind of stuff, getting this right, is the difference between people who consistently reach higher and higher levels or people that just end up plateauing and losing motivation and burning out and usually ending training altogether. So thanks again for the super fun question, Ryan. And if anyone else has some good fun questions that they want to throw in that training lab, throw them in there because if I like the question, you will get an answer.